Hello YouTubers, it's DasGregor, and I've got another story for you. This story is called The Visitor, and it takes place back in Pennsylvania where I used to live. I used to rent a one-room schoolhouse that had been converted into a two-bedroom home. This schoolhouse was built in the 1700s, and also I found that there had been another property close by where there was a Presbyterian church as well, called Dickinson Presbyterian Church. Behind the church, of course, was a graveyard. The landlord had told me that the church had been torn down many years before and been rebuilt down the road, but the graveyard still remained behind the church, and that there might be people who come to visit every once in a while. Most of the graves had been pushed over and grass had grown over the top of them, so you didn't know where they were or you could see them. But there were 3 graves that I found right away after moving into the property. One grave was of a man named William Moore. He was born in the 1700s and died in the early 1800s. His wife, I can only assume, was buried next to him, Abigail, who also was born in the 1700s and 1800s. And then his son I found next to them. At least I assume it would be his son, because he was born about 20 to 25 years after the other two, and died, of course, a few years after his parents, I assume, died. So there were 3 graves out there, and it was quite interesting to think of the history that was just right around the area where I lived. Well, one evening, as I was doing the dishes, I happened to look outside, and I noticed that there seemed to be a woman at the graves. Now, my landlord had told me that some people may come to visit off and on, and in fact, a few years back, the Boy Scouts used to come and have a ceremony on Memorial Day because there are some Civil War graves as well there. Most of those, unfortunately, have been buried. But he always told me that someone might come by at one time, and that I should expect company any time. So it didn't startle me that there was a woman at the grave, but I thought it'd be very interesting to talk to her to see if she knew a little bit more about these people who were buried out there in my yard. So I tried to give her a little bit of respect, and I slowly walked outside. I didn't want to startle her or anything, so I just gave her distance for a bit. But as I got closer, it was kind of strange. She was standing there, and she seemed to be weeping, and she seemed to be mumbling something about being forgotten, or that they left her behind. And I was kind of strange, so I was going to ask her, I was going to introduce myself and ask her if I could help her in any way. But as soon as I began to talk to her, as soon as I said, "Excuse me," she twirled around, startled look of fright. She was pale white, and she just turned around and started running away. She had no car, she had no bike. She must have walked there. But I started after her, but it was kind of a dark evening. The fog was starting to roll in. I was surrounded by farmland on 3 different sides, and also with a perimeter of trees and forest area. So it wasn't very uncommon in the evening time and early morning for a lot of fog to be around my home. It kind of gave it a nice secluded spot, even though I was only 6 miles outside of the city. But I tried to follow her, and as I got closer to the road where she'd gone, her footsteps seemed to disappear, and there was nothing else there. I thought this was a very strange occurrence, but I just figured maybe I'd startle her, maybe she didn't realize that someone still lived in the house. I'm not sure. So I let it be. About a year passed, and I didn't even realize it had been exactly a year, but I was once again out in my sunroom area, and I looked out, and I thought I recognized her, and there was the lady again. So I thought, well, I'll go back out and introduce myself. And so as I was walking out, and she was on her knees, and she was crying and sobbing, and it just concerned me that she was so upset. So I went to speak with her again, but as soon as I did, she once again stood up, ran off, and wouldn't say a word to me. It really bothered me because this is twice that this had happened. And as I began to think about it, I realized that this is twice on the same day over a year. I thought, this is kind of strange, this isn't natural. And it really got my curiosity up. So what I did next was I went ahead and wrote down the names of the people that were on the stones that I had seen. And I decided to go to the local library and do some research to find out if I could find a little bit more information about this. What I found was that William Moore had settled in the area. He'd actually founded Mooredale, that his wife was in fact Abigail, and that he did have a son, William. And then as I was going through things, I also found that William had been married to a woman named Tabitha. Now, that's really quite interesting. There are 3 graves, but the stories that I've read, the history that I've looked up, says that there were 4 people. So after doing my research, I went back to my home and I began to look around a little bit more closely to where the graves were. And it was quite interesting because there were actually a few post holes where a wrought iron fence, I was told, once went around just their area. And what was also strange was that I had dug up 3 of these post holes, and they didn't center properly for 3 graves. So as I looked at these post holes, I thought, okay, I've got one over here, one directly across from it and down. So that would mean that the 4th should be straight back from on this one side, which left a large area of grass. That brought my curiosity up just a wee bit more. So I began to space out about how far apart these graves were, and I actually took my weed eater because I didn't know what else to use it, so I didn't want to take a shovel or something, and I started to allow it to kind of go around as I normally would trim the graves to make them nice, and I realized it was hitting another area of the rock, or what looked like there was a rock next to William. So I got a little bit closer and started to pull away the sod from where it was in the grass, and as I did, I was able to uncover a 4th grave. And as I got this 4th grave uncovered, I read the inscription on the grave, and it said Tabitha Moore, bride of William Moore. I thought, wow, this is very interesting. So I pulled away the rest of it, and I cleaned it up really nicely. And I decided, well, let's just keep it nice, and maybe this woman will come back and I can talk to her and let her see what I've done. She didn't come back for a couple months, and once again another year passed. And then I happened to look out there, this time reminding myself what part of the year it was, and there she stood out in the yard. I can only tell you, it's kind of like the back of the hairs on your neck, or the neck, or the hairs on the back of your neck. I can say that, right? I really can. You know how that tingling feeling is when something's just weird or just not right? Well, either which way, I remember it so clearly, because I remember her being out there again, and she was standing there. And so I walked out slowly to her, and she was still weeping, she was crying. But this time when she saw me, she looked up at me. She had such peace on her face. And she wasn't crying because she was sad. She was crying because she was so happy. And all she could say was, thank you. Thank you for finding me. Thank you for making me know that they didn't forget me. Thank you, thank you. And I said, excuse me, but are you related to these? And she just looked at me and said, I guess you could say that. And I said, well, what's your name? And she looked at me and said her name was Tabitha. I didn't know what to say. I started to talk to her again, and I guess I must have glanced away, and when I looked back, she wasn't there anymore. I went back to the library the next day and I started doing some more research. I started looking for photographs. And as I searched for photographs, I came across a wedding photograph that was taken back in the early 1800s. And I looked at that, and my mouth just dropped. There on one side was William and his wife Abigail. There next to him was their son Robert. And next to Robert was the woman I saw in my yard. She looked the same in that photo as she did in real life. And I swear that she looked as if she was as real as anything else. And at that moment, I realized for the last 3 times that I'd seen her, that I had seen a ghost. And that ghost was troubled because her grave had been covered. I don't know how many years before I took ownership of the home, but it had been covered, and she thought that she had been lost to the people who had put her there. And she was in such anguish until I was able to find it and recover it and restore the grave to almost its original setting. I lived in that house for a couple more years before moving on, and she never did come back. But I'll tell you this, that was the most interesting, strangest occurrence that had ever happened to me, ever living in such an area. And living in Pennsylvania, where there's a lot of history, there are a lot of things that happened to me in those 5 years. And maybe sometime I'll be able to give a chance to tell you a little bit more of some of those other things that did occur to me in that strange old schoolhouse. I had some strange dreams while I was there. And each time that I had a dream or thought I was seeing something or someone, I know that there was always a story behind it. And if I searched enough in the old archives, I always seemed to find what I was looking for. And it always seemed to coincide with some experience that I had had. I'm not a spook, and I'm not a weirdo. Well, some of you might think I'm a weirdo. But let me tell you, I normally don't believe in ghosts until that moment. But it made a believer out of me. And I hope I've made a believer out of you. So until next time, I hope you enjoyed my story, and we'll chat again. So, tschüss, auf Wiedersehen, arrivederci, good evening, good day, and good night. Or whatever you're having, have it and enjoy it. And remember, it's Halloween time, it's October, and it's time for the scary stories and the ghosts and the ghouls and the witches and the warlocks to come out. It's time for all the monsters and the ghosts to be all over the place. Enjoy. Bye.